Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who is Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, has now been appointed to the United Nations High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs. Now, this advisory board was formed back in 2018 to try and advise on broad economic and social issues of global significance. For more on the way forward, let's bring in Elizabeth, who joins us now via our video link. Elizabeth, thanks for your time and welcome to the program. Given your vast experience, take us through the direction you're hoping the board will now take through your contributions.
This is the second board that has been appointed. As you indicated, the first such high-level board was appointed in 2018. The objective of this particular board, and we've just started our term literally this month, is to focus specifically on some of the challenges that have emerged in the area of sustainable development globally because of the COVID pandemic. And so the mandate that we have is, of course, the SDG mandate in the first instance, which is to make sure that we leave no one behind. But more important, there is a second dimension to it, which is about helping to build trust. How do we build trust? By addressing inequalities, by making sure that the digital divide doesn't exacerbate these inequalities, by making sure that there is sufficient financing for development in developing economies. These are big challenges that COVID has made even more difficult to achieve. We've seen that, but it's also created a significant possibility through the huge fiscal stimulus that we've seen around the world to actually transform economies and to ensure there's development. So from my side, these are critical dimensions that I would like to see on the table and would like to bring to the discussion, specifically around African development, African challenges that have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic.
You say these are huge challenges. That's probably an understatement, but we probably agree on that score. You also speak about building trust. Trust between whom?
So, and on a number of levels. I think the first is to build trust in institutions, because if there's one lesson that we can take out of the COVID pandemic, is that in instances where in societies where the population has high trust in leadership, in the institutions, the ability to respond more effectively is greater. What we have seen over the last 10 years, though, putting aside the COVID pandemic, is that the growing inequalities both within countries but also across countries has created a trust deficit, in the sense that there's a perception, and quite rightly in many instances, that the rules of the game are not intended to help those who are marginalized, those who are poor, those who face significant social and economic barriers, but they're there to entrench the elite, both within countries and globally. And I think that's the dimension of trust, and the importance that this is a global responsibility. This is not about, well, what is South Africa going to do with its unemployed or its significant inequality? You know, what is the DRC going to do, or whatever, or India for that matter? There is an element that requires all countries to work together to address some of the global rules and global regulations that actually make it very difficult for countries to then realize their own developmental objectives. And so some of these are around global governance issues, which various UN bodies are involved in. We just need to think about some of the rules of the World Trade Organization, just to raise one point. And we saw that South Africa last year, together with India, tried to put a proposal through to waive IPR regulations on key equipment and so on to fight COVID.
Yeah, and the concerns or the trust deficit, as you put it, I'm sure can be backed by empirical data, right? Oxfam recently releasing a report about how some of the wealthiest people in the world have been able to essentially remain unscathed in their wealth despite the devastating economic fallout of this pandemic. There are real challenges in trying to ensure that the development is an inclusive one. You know the saying, nothing about us without us type mentality. How do we get that right?
Well, that's the trillion-dollar question.
Yeah.
$1 trillion is the amount of money that has actually been mobilized over the last year just to deal with the pandemic, specifically in the developed in the developed world. I mean, just to give you an indication of some of these of this inequity, the UN Development. The Economic and Social Affairs Division came out with a report literally a couple of days ago, where the figures they highlighted was that in the last year, for every dollar of fiscal stimulus that was rolled out in low-income countries, $580 this is per capita, $580 were rolled out in the developed world. Okay, so how do you deal with this? Well, in the first instance, of course, there is the national set of political decisions that need to be made in any country that may create a more enabling environment for inclusivity. I mean, that's the first point, and we there is a responsibility there. But then equally, there is the responsibility at the global level, and I would see that going in two directions. The one relates to are we sure that the way in which we have shaped rules, whether they are in trade or in global financing or whatever, do not further disadvantage developing economies, and particularly those with exacerbated inequality? So that's the one is about the global rules. The other one is the extent to which we all together, because this is one planet, and if there's one thing we have learned over the last several years is that its capacity is finite. Can we mobilize all of this trillions and trillions of dollars of money that we know sort of crosses borders on a daily basis or on a weekly basis? Can we mobilize some of that both publicly and privately to actually begin to contribute towards the gap to achieving the sustainable development goals? This is difficult. The question is whether COVID presents the crisis that we needed to make us really focus on what is absolutely an existential threat to us.
Absolutely. And not only is it difficult, it's also not new, if we're being honest. Classical scholars have spoken about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and the possible uprising. What do we say to people who are disillusioned that, the status quo in its current form actually will never change?
Well, if we look at history, there has been change. I think in many parts of the world, many people have been brought out of poverty. We just need to see not only the example of China, but a number of other countries in Asia, particularly where life is better today than it might have been even 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. There is clearly, and I've highlighted now in my earlier remarks, there is clearly the dimension of political will by political leadership, both nationally and regionally and globally. But I think there is another dimension, and we've seen that, in fact, over the last 20 years, whether it's, when it started in the early 2000s with the anti-globalization movements, we've seen it now with the climate change movements, also among youth and social movements, is that it's also important that ordinary people, even those who you may consider marginalized and vulnerable, actually have a voice, and they can make their voice heard, and they actually have agency. And as long as we as ordinary citizens working in our various civil society organizations and in our social movements never forget that, I think that is a key pressure point for elites. And we've seen elites do respond. Sometimes they don't respond necessarily as quickly as one wants, right, but they do respond. And I think that's important for all of us to take away.
Elizabeth, you have a mammoth task ahead. Congratulations on your appointment, and thanks very much for your indulgence. Really appreciate it. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos is a chief executive of the South African Institute of UN Affairs and has recently been appointed to the UN Board on Economic and Social Issues. Elizabeth, thanks very much for your time.